I think most people are drawn to media that reflects their own experiences. In 2016, I remember wanting media that was darker, more realistic, and indulged my growing cynicism. I was not having the greatest time. Enter My Hero Academia. Created by Kohei Horikoshi, serialized in Weekly Shonen Jump in 2014 and airing in 2016, it follows Izuku Midoriya, a boy born without powers in a world filled with superheroes, and his journey to becoming number one. What I try to do here is explore the things that resonate with me. At the end of the day, this is mostly a conversation with myself about why I feel a certain way about different things. My Hero Academia, a bright and optimistic story about someone overcoming the odds, fighting for good, and making his dreams come true, was everything I didn't want in a show at the time. It was too naive and too immature for my tastes, so I avoided it, which in retrospect was probably the most immature thing I could have done. That's why, when I finally got around to watching it a couple of years later, it came as a complete shock that I enjoyed it. A lot more than I thought I actually would. The great irony of it all is that now, I think the optimistic tone of the story is part of the reason why it works so well. How is it that a show that seemingly went against everything I actually wanted resonated with me as much as it did? What is My Hero Academia trying to say, and why is the optimistic tone so important to that message? In trying to figure that out, I did something I don't normally do. I went back. I went through Horikoshi's previous works, what I could read through anyways, to see if there was anything I could learn from his previous stories about the themes he explores and how he chooses to present them. Let's go back to the beginning. Between 2007 and 2008, Horikoshi had 3 one-shot stories published in Akamaru Jump. As Horikoshi's earliest published works, these stories contain some of the roughest and most unpolished versions of the ideas he would later explore. The first was a story called Tenko. Taking place in feudal Japan, it follows a character named Hana who wants to become a warrior, something she can't be as a woman. It also features a boy named Tenko who has the power to turn the things he touches to dust. This little boy has the most obvious connection to My Hero Academia. His powers and name are pretty much exactly what Shigaraki would become, and from what I'm told, his backstory becomes a lot more interesting depending on how far ahead you are in My Hero Academia. But what I was more interested in here was Hana. As the main character for the story, she lays out a pretty good template for the kinds of protagonists Horikoshi tends to write. After being rescued by warriors years ago, she dreams of becoming one herself, something she's ridiculed for as a woman by the people of her village. She then meets Tenko, who uses his power to destroy the swords of warriors, earning him the nickname Battle Vandal. Because of his past experiences, he sees swords as tools that kill, and has vowed to destroy every last one of them. As the story goes on, Hana comes to realize that the warriors she idolized were not what she imagined. After an encounter with the person that saved her in the past, she learns that the warriors see themselves as tools for the Lord of the Land. Tools that kill. At the climax of the story, rejecting these ideas of what a warrior is and the purpose of the weapon they carry, she states out loud what she aspires to be: a warrior that saves others, her sword used to protect. That's roughly what happens in this story, and it's very apparent that some of the things Horikoshi would later write about have been present since the very beginning. This idea of trying to become a warrior, that's pretty much a hero by a different name. You can actually see a lot of Izuku in Hana. They have similar goals of trying to be a quote-unquote hero, and the people they idolize are dismissive of those goals. Albeit, the warriors in Tenko are portrayed as a much more antagonistic force. By the end of the story, they are pretty much the villains. They ridicule Hana for her dream and try to kill her for getting in their way. By contrast, Toshinori's dismissal of Izuku is a lot more empathetic and is more of an emotional obstacle than a physical threat. In general with Tenko though, it really feels like Horikoshi wanted to tell a superhero story, considering that the setup for the main conflict is practically unchanged in My Hero Academia. That's not really a bad thing, just sort of the impression that I get. But as his earliest work, like I said, this is definitely the roughest version of what he would try to do later. But taking what he learned from Tenko, Horikoshi refined his ideas and was a bit more direct about heroism with his second one-shot, My Hero. I won't spend too much time on this one since if you've watched or read My Hero Academia, you basically know what happens here. My Hero takes place in a world filled with superheroes and follows a character named Jack Midoriya, a weak and sickly man who dreams of becoming one. My Hero's connections to My Hero Academia are the most blatant out of any of Horikoshi's other stories. Jack is a prototype Izuku, although Izuku is much younger and way less scary looking, and the story is basically a pilot for My Hero Academia. While the story arc here is generally the same as in Tenko, I think it's safe to say that My Hero is more directly related to My Hero Academia since, you know, they both share the same name and both are actually about superheroes. At least, nominally. There is a notable difference between the two when it comes to their portrayals of superheroes. While both take place in a world where hero is a profession that requires a license, the heroes in the one-shot don't necessarily have actual superpowers. All of the heroes in My Hero use special equipment which Jack works to sell at his company. Why I think this distinction is important though is something I'll get back to. Shinka Rhapsody is Horikoshi's last one-shot from this time, and it is by far the most mysterious. As far as I can tell, almost no one has actually read this thing. I couldn't find a copy of it anywhere, so there's not much I can actually say when it comes to connecting it to Horikoshi's other stories. But from what little I have seen, I think Shinka Rhapsody is where the basic idea of One for All came from. The story seems to take place in a world where people actually have powers, and the main character, Masashi, has some sort of strength ability that grows stronger over time. What's interesting about it though is that this ability seems to involve a process where that power manifests different traits, changing and evolving the longer it's used. As someone who's never read My Hero Academia past where season 4 of the show is, I find that very interesting. These one-shots aren't exactly the best, but as Horikoshi's earliest published works, I think Tenko and My Hero are perfectly fine. Like I said, I wasn't able to get a hold of Shinka Rhapsody. At the very least, I do think they are interesting enough, especially if you're a fan of My Hero Academia. A lot of the groundwork for that story was laid out in these one-shots. I know I didn't go through them in a lot of detail, but what I wanted to do was look at the themes Horikoshi explores and see how he chooses to present them. Tenko and My Hero play out in almost exactly the same way as My Hero Academia, and I'd assume that Shinka Rhapsody does as well. An outcast protagonist trying to become some version of a hero, optimistic in light of the challenges they face. In the most general sense, that's what these stories are, and it's a formula that Horikoshi has stuck with to this day. While that might not seem like it's very informative, it kind of was for me, because what's interesting about these one-shots is that they don't really resonate with me like how My Hero Academia does. While part of that is certainly because Horikoshi has gotten better at writing over the years, I don't think that's everything. I reread the first chapter of My Hero Academia, and just on the general story and setup alone, I don't think these one-shots are nearly as good, despite the fact that they cover all of the same story and emotional beats. So there's something else going on here. However, I didn't think that these stories alone were enough to give a complete picture as to what that thing is. But of course, these weren't the only works I read. I also went through the other two series Horikoshi worked on before My Hero Academia. The first one being Omagadogizu was a series published in Weekly Shonen Jump in 2011. It follows a girl named Hana Aoi who starts a part-time job at a zoo. The twist is that the zoo is run by a bunny man, and the animals become human hybrids when the zoo closes. Although that rule kinda gets thrown out pretty early on. This story is kind of an outlier when compared to Horikoshi's other works. It's the only one where the protagonist isn't trying to become an outright hero of some sort. Although there are still vaguely superhero-like elements present here. Sheena, the bunny man, has a signature move called Rapid Peace where he punches people with a peace sign, which, okay, But at their core, most superhero stories are about coming of age, and Omagadogizu is much more focused on that side of things. Hana is ridiculed by her classmates for being obscenely clumsy. There's a point in the story where she trips like 26 times on the way to school, and her main motivation for taking a job at the zoo was to gain more confidence in herself, and more generally, to find a place to belong. That's pretty much the overarching theme of the entire story. Sheena is actually the victim of a curse. Turned into a rabbit by a great spirit at a young age, he is tasked with creating the greatest zoo on Earth to regain his humanity. But while that's his goal on paper, he's driven more by wanting friends. Sheena's new appearance left him isolated and rejected by his classmates. So when he discovered that the curse also gave him the ability to turn animals into human hybrids he could actually talk to, all he really wanted to do was play with them and give the animals a place to be loved. Finding a place for yourself and others is a theme you can kinda graft onto My Hero Academia in a very general sense. Izuku in the beginning wants to find a place and purpose for himself. There's even a bit here that ties into what Kirishima goes through in Season 4. Later in Omagadogizu, we meet a character named Yuki who takes a part-time job at a circus to try find a place to belong by learning to stand up for himself, which is similar to Kirishima learning to not run from fear, except in a much broader and slightly different context. But even though Horikoshi does expand on these ideas more in My Hero Academia, these thematic connections are fairly weak at best and not necessarily the main point of that story. Which isn't to say that there aren't any more obvious connections here. Some of the characters from Omagadogizu do end up in My Hero Academia. Uabami and Gang Orca are practically unchanged, Hawks is here, although as a literal bird person, and even Toru's gloves are here. Some of the arcs from My Hero Academia I think are pulled directly from this story too. There's an arc involving an aquarium that plays out in a very similar fashion to the hero internship arc, with the main goal being a rescue. The villain here, Isana, is sort of like a prototype overhaul as the leader and director of a Yakuza-like organization at the aquarium, and the arc ends in a very similar way with Isana turning into a giant monstrous creature that ends up getting defeated by being punched a whole lot. But in terms of overall theme, that's about it. So, let's move on to Horikoshi's final series. Barrage was a series published in Weekly Shonen Jump in 2012. I'm gonna be honest, I think Barrage is super weird. It takes place on a planet called Industria and follows a scrappy boy from the slums named Astro. But if you thought that this was a rags to riches story where Astro slowly works his way up to the top, let me tell you right now, that's not what happens. At least, not really. Instead, Astro is confronted by Prince Bulge, heir to the throne of Industria, who looks and sounds just like him. Astro is given something called the Org by Bulge, which I'll get back to in a bit, and is told that he is now the prince. Bulge is killed right in front of Astro immediately after this for unknown reasons, and the story follows Astro as he becomes prince in his place. That being said, if you are now expecting this to be a story that focuses heavily on the politics and lore of a distant space planet, I'm sorry to say, that's not what happens either. Astro confesses to the king almost immediately that the real prince is dead, which the king is sad about but isn't terribly concerned with, despite the fact that it was a political assassination. But either way, it doesn't really matter because, you remember that org thing? Well, as it turns out, it's actually a weapon that can only be summoned by those who, and I quote, possess the disposition of a king. And surprise, surprise, Astro can use it. So any questions of whether or not Astro is a legitimate prince really don't matter. Instead, the main question for this series seems to be, is Astro worthy of becoming a ruler? It's a weird setup to get to pretty much the same place as Horikoshi's other stories. A boy trying to prove to the people doubting him that he is worthy of becoming a king. The thing driving Astro being his love of family. Not just his either, but all families. As a boy who grew up in the slums, he knows how precious that is. And of course, Astro's beliefs are challenged. His mentor, Tiamat, who seems to be cut from the same cloth as Aizawa, doesn't think those ideals are good enough for a king. But after seeing Astro fight and seeing how strong his convictions are, Tiamat slowly begins to change his mind. And to really drive home that idea, later on in the story, we meet someone named Tiko who is Eiji Ochako with a gun. She lives in a part of Industria that's been overtaken by criminal aliens, and goes around trying to retake the city for the sake of her adoptive family. But like I said at the start, I was mostly interested in the protagonists of these stories as a vehicle for the themes presented. And with this, we have a clearer picture of the kinds of heroes Horikoshi tends to write and their goals. A woman trying to become a warrior when the world says she can't. A weak and sickly man trying to become a hero in his own way. A clumsy girl trying to prove she has a replace a destitute boy trying to prove he can become a king. They all face incredible hardship from the world around them in trying to achieve their goals, with an optimistic tone highlighting their perseverance and the strength of their will. That's exactly what happens in My Hero Academia. But after reading through all of these stories, I think there is a tangible difference in how My Hero Academia presents its main conflict compared to the rest. And you can see seeds of that planted in Barrage. One of the more interesting aspects of Barrage is the main villain, a literal devil man named Black. Years ago, he served as a soldier for the king, fighting to protect the people of Industria. He was also a surrogate father to Astro for a time, teaching him how to survive on the streets. Black wanted to protect everyone from what he saw as crooked, but after years of service, he began to realize that the people he swore to protect were already crooked. Broken and disillusioned, he vowed to burn Industria to the ground. While Horikoshi has dipped his toes into somewhat dark villains by this point, Black is by far the most cynical in his early works. He is morally wrong, of course. His goal is mass genocide, so that sort of makes Astro win by default. But his worldview and very existence are interesting because it forces Astro to confront a reality that challenges everything he believes. Astro wanted to protect all families because he sees them as unambiguously good. But what if the families Astro swore to protect go on to destroy others? Black is living proof that this can happen. Can Astro go on despite that fact? Can he stay optimistic even when he knows that the very thing he believes is wrong? Barrage never resolved this conflict. Black was quickly defeated, and that dramatic question was never really answered, likely the result of a rushed ending due to what was happening behind the scenes. There's another thing I think is worth looking at when talking about My Hero Academia. And again, it's something I don't normally tend to look at. The author's life when the story was created. Both of Horikoshi's previous works were cancelled after a very short run. Omagadogizu after 37 chapters, or 38 depending on if you count the epilogue, and Barrage after just 16. It was out of these events that My Hero Academia was born. My second series was axed really quickly after such a short time of serialization, and I was pretty depressed about things. I didn't have the energy left to create new things. So I decided to add happy things and happy events that I had drawn into my previous works into this new series. This is a quote from Horikoshi, or at least I'm pretty sure it is. I actually couldn't find the original interview where this was from, so someone could have just made this up. But I do think it's real because of how obvious it is. There are so many elements from all of his previous stories that made their way into My Hero Academia. Different characters and happy events, just like he said. But I can't help but wonder if Horikoshi's situation in life at the time played a role in creating the world he placed those things into. If I was in his position, I would start to feel a lot of insecurity. Maybe I'm not good enough for this. Maybe the people who tell me I can't do anything are right. That emotion, that hopelessness, is exactly what I see in the world of My Hero Academia. In his previous stories, the worlds his protagonists face in trying to achieve their stated goals are obviously and clearly wrong from the start. Just because Hana is a woman, that doesn't mean she can't be a warrior. Hana does have a place with people who love her for who she is. Even though Astro grew up in the slums, that doesn't mean that he isn't worthy of being king. The latter is even more true. Later in Barrage, we learn that Astro is actually the king's son, the true prince. It's kind of complicated, although I don't know how much of that was influenced by the series' impending cancellation. The only one where things aren't so clear-cut is, interestingly enough, My Hero. Jack is pretty sickly, which prevents him from becoming a hero. That's understandable. But remember how I said that the heroes of that story don't necessarily have actual superpowers? Well, that sort of means that there isn't much separating Jack from the heroes he idolizes besides a license. By the end of the story, even though Jack isn't a hero by trade, he still becomes a hero in his own way, and he's presented as being on the same level as those heroes, as equals to them. The rules said Jack couldn't be a hero because of how weak he was, but that wasn't true. It's easier to smile and be optimistic when the people who say you can't do something are wrong. But the world of My Hero Academia is different. Compared to Horikoshi's other stories, it's more openly aggressive and hostile towards Izuku, especially in the beginning, because he is different. He isn't equal to his peers. Izuku's first words in My Hero Academia say as much. People are not born equal in this world. So when people tell Izuku that he cannot be a hero without powers, they are right. And Izuku knows it. How do you cope with that? When taken in that context, the optimistic tone of My Hero Academia isn't quite the same as Horikoshi's other stories. There, it was an optimism based on hope. The world is wrong and I can prove it. But here, it feels more like an optimism born out of desperation. Because if Izuku wasn't optimistic, it might break him. I know that he gets a lot of flack as a protagonist, but at least for me, what makes Izuku such a compelling hero is the fact that he has every reason not to be a hero. Here's a fun thought. Deku has a villain's backstory. A boy born without powers in a world filled with superheroes, he's beaten, rejected by society, and told that he can't be a hero by the person he looked up to the most. That's a villain's backstory. That's Syndrome from The Incredibles. Considering that Izuku's able to think quickly, strategize on the fly, and has an extensive knowledge on pretty much every hero, there's a version of this story that you could tell where Deku is a master tactician that tears down an unfair society. And I think Horikoshi was fully aware of the implications of the world he created for this story. It's not easy trying to be optimistic in an environment like that. A society that so brazenly rejects people and shuns them as outcasts is bound to create a group that wants nothing more than to see that society turn to dust. A desperate optimism facing against an unfair reality. That's the struggle that I see at the heart of this story. And I don't think that's just limited to the first chapters and episodes of My Hero Academia either. It seems like an integral part of the narrative. There's an entire arc of this story dedicated to putting on a show for the sole purpose of making a single little girl smile. I think that's why the tone of the story works as well as it does for me, because the optimism present here isn't a given. It takes work to achieve and maintain. And what I think makes the framing of this optimism so powerful is what it reveals about the true nature of superheroes and the heroism they inspire. There's one more piece of media I want to talk about here, one that I think played at least a small part in creating this story. Let's talk about
pizza time.
SpiderMan II was directed by Sam Raimi with a story by Alfred Goff, Miles Millar, and Michael Chabon, and a screenplay by Alvin Sargent. This movie is kinda dumb. It's cheesy and silly and pretty much everything you'd expect out of a superhero movie that came out in 2004. As a heads up, I will be spoiling it just a bit, which I think is fair game since this movie came out over 15 years ago. A fact that absolutely terrifies me. Comparing My Hero Academia to Spider-Man isn't all that surprising. Horikoshi himself said that he's a big fan of Spider-Man. You can even see that in some of his art. Here's another fun thought. Spider-Man and Deku have the exact opposite origin story. Peter chooses not to take action even though he has the power to, and it ends up getting someone close to him killed. Izuku chooses to take action even though he has no power, and it ends up getting someone close to him saved. Was this intentional? Probably not, but I think it's pretty cool. Aside from that though, there's a good chance that Horikoshi was inspired by this movie in some way, since their approaches to superheroes are really similar. While SpiderMan II isn't exactly unique, in the same unsourced interview I quoted from earlier, Horikoshi did say that his first experience with Spider-Man was the movie, and I think that's a good enough reason for me to talk about it, because I love SpiderMan II. It's one of my favorite movies, even after all of these years. And the reason I like it so much is the same reason I like My Hero Academia. SpiderMan II takes place a couple of years after Peter Parker puts on the mask. And while on the surface it's about saving the city from Dr. Octopus, the main focus is on Peter himself. If you haven't seen the movie, it's pretty easy to get the impression that it's just goofy and silly, which, you know, is fair because it definitely is those things, but the movie pretty much does the exact same thing with its tone that My Hero Academia does. For all the cheese and camp here, Peter's life in this movie sucks. Being Spider-Man actively ruins Peter's life. The movie is unrelenting and unforgiving. He can't keep up with school and work, his relationships are falling apart, nothing seems to be going right for him, all because of his role as a superhero. It's obvious that Peter can't live up to the ideal of being Spider-Man, so it forces him to answer the question, why bother trying at all? Here's what I love about this movie. It shows us what superheroes really are. What Peter sees in that suit are all of the ideals instilled into him by Uncle Ben. The hopes and dreams of the man Ben wanted Peter to become. A person who will do the right thing no matter what. With great power comes great responsibility. That's what being a hero means to Peter. And despite how happy and optimistic the movie is, the entire point of Spider-Man 2 is to say, that's a goal Peter Parker is never going to be able to achieve. What we see in our heroes can differ though. What Izuku and Bakugo see in All Might are different. For one, it's someone who can always save people with a smile. For another, it's someone who can always win against villains. As the story goes on, we see the kinds of heroes all of the characters want to be. Someone who can always help their parents. Someone who won't run in the face of fear. Someone who can save a million lives. Those are the ideals that each character wants to embody, the heroes they want to be. The constant struggle that these characters face is trying to be optimistic when they know for a fact that they might not be able to live up to those things. That's the nature of superheroes in these stories. They are symbols filled with each of our hopes and dreams that ultimately might not come true. It's an absolutely crushing message for seemingly optimistic stories. About halfway through Spider-Man 2, Peter gives up. The pressure of his spiraling personal life and his constant failure to live up to his ideals take a toll on him. So, Peter chooses to stop being Spider-Man. For a time, it makes him happy, and he gets his life back together. But he isn't fulfilled in the way he thought he would be. Eventually, what brings him back is a talk with Aunt May. And what she tells him essentially boils down to this. Superheroes taunt us with things we can't be and dreams we can't hope to reach. But we were never meant to. They inspire us to do more than we can and tell us to hold on just a second longer.
I believe there's a hero in all of us. Gives us strength, makes us noble. Even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most. Even our dreams.
I have my own ideas of what a superhero is. Everyone has theirs, but this one is personal. It's someone that has a strength I don't possess, a figure with a will beyond my own. And even though I've projected this image onto a person outside of me, the truth is that my hero is a goal that I have for myself that I could never possibly reach. In Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker is not Spider-Man. Peter is a person, trying to live up to an impossible ideal. Spider-Man is everything Peter wishes he could be. That's the struggle that resonates with me. My Hero Academia is filled with those moments. It's Izuku running out to save Bakugo in a fight he cannot win. It's Toshinori fighting all for one with no strength left. It's Medio holding back Overhaul without any powers. The way I see these moments is that each of these characters are faced with the undeniable truth that they cannot be the heroes they want to be. But the reality is, that's something they've always known. Deku, All Might, Lemillion are impossible standards to live up to, but they stay optimistic. They have to. It's born out of a desperate attempt to fight against an unfair world with what little power they have to change it. They might not reach those goals, but they can at least get closer. For me, a superhero story where the hero just smiles and fights for good isn't all that interesting, and I think that's true for most people. Everyone looks for different things within these stories, and this is what I value. Stories that at their core are about people struggling to live up to their own impossible expectations. There are problems with My Hero Academia, Spider-Man 2, and stories like them, of course. These things aren't perfect, but I realize now that the value I get out of these stories isn't really based on anything objective, and if I'm being honest with myself, it never has been. The reason I love these shows and movies isn't because I think the story and directing are good, even though I think they are. I love these stories because they inspire me to be a better person. The heroism in these stories isn't just about doing the right thing, it's about looking at your own impossible goals and taking on that challenge anyways. With My Hero Academia, Horikoshi could have wrote a story that channeled his frustrations, a look into a terrible world filled with terrible people. Knowing what I do about his situation, that's probably what I would have done. But he didn't. Instead, he wrote a story, a simple one, and tried to fill it with happy things. A story about an unfair world and a boy living in it, trying desperately to be happy, attempting to smile in the face of something impossible, and against all odds, trying to be the hero he never really thought he could be. Maybe Horikoshi knew that the best thing to hear when it's easy to be cynical is something sincere, something that acknowledges how difficult it can be to smile, something as simple as a story that says, "Don't give up." As always, thank you so much for watching. This one was a doozy to make. I wanted to get it out earlier this month, but stuff happens. I also want to give a special thank you to Ben from C Tactics for helping me out with my copyright issue. Ben, I really appreciate it. You can check out my Twitter for extra stuff from this video, and there is a lot of extra stuff from this one. I'm at It's Kyle Robes on Twitter and Instagram.